In 1962, St Bridget's Catholic Church in Goulburn desperately needed a new toilet block. And despite repeated requests for funding, the government, which was now beginning to push back against the idea of state funding of Catholic schools, refused to build the toilet block. And when the local member finally refused to meet with leaders of the Catholic Church, what ensued was then known as the Goulburn School Strike, in which the bishop of the day simply announced one weekend that not just St Bridget's, but all Catholic schools in Goulburn would be shut from next Monday, and that parents were to send their students to the local state schools. There was nearly 2,000 students enrolled in Catholic schools, and when they appeared at state schools the following week, clearly the state schools were overwhelmed and unable to take on board those extra students. In effect, they discovered the Catholic Church and the Catholic schools were, to use a more modern term, too big to fail. So St Bridget's got their toilet block, and there's never been any serious doubt about the ongoing funding of Catholic schools ever since, though we might argue a little bit back and forward about the level of funding. So I spoke to one of the architects of that school strike 20 or so years ago, a lovely old man who looked back very fondly and said it was such an empowering time when they realised that they, as the Catholic Church, had a voice in society, that we had influence and we could make a difference. And so that group then moved on to say, well, what is the next thing we need to use our prophetic voice for? And they realised that the next fight for the Catholic Church was going to be around the upcoming legalisation of abortion. And so really the architects of the school strike became the nucleus of the pro-life movement in Australia. But sadly, that man said, looking back, he said, we never had another win. The voice of the church diminished over time, and repeated requests to slow down or to make changes in abortion legislation fell on deaf ears for government ever since, and more recently about euthanasia as well. He said, we never had another win. And we might look back, I guess, and lament that loss of the Catholic voice, as indeed this man very much did. But I want to situate that today within, I guess, a much larger context, because it's not just about us as one church or about one or two issues that we care about. There's a much bigger story to tell here. And it's important we do, because it really speaks to, I guess, the scriptures we hear this weekend. Because today we hear Jesus spoken of as one who spoke with authority, that these words had the authority behind them. And that's matched up with the book reading from Deuteronomy, where we hear about what it means to be prophetic. To be prophetic is not to tell the future. To be prophetic is to speak out the values of God, the message of God to the community, whether people want to hear it or not. And so the question is really, how can we be a prophetic church? How can we speak to our society about the values of Jesus and the values of the kingdom of God? So let's look at it this way. Think about society, think about three circles to represent the different groupings of our society. So think about one of them being government, one being business, and the third being what we might call civil society. And that is really, I guess, all non-profit and non-business or government groups. So it includes churches, it includes trade unions, it includes charities, it includes non-profit groups and charities and social groups. And if we look back over the last century, we can see how for at least the first half of the 20th century, it was these groups, civil society, which spoke about the values which mattered for society and for families. And so it was churches, unions, the Country Women's Association, other groups, which set the tone and spoke to government, and government then legislated to ensure the business abided by these kinds of values. And so to use a couple of examples, we saw that trading hours for retail had limits, that they were 9 to 5 on weekdays and up 9 to 12 on Saturdays. Why did that matter? Well, because it was important that families spent time together, that people neither had to work all weekend or spent all weekend shopping. Church on Sunday was a cornerstone of Australian life, and the restrictions which government placed on business helped to facilitate that. So too, there was restrictions on the hours of pubs and clubs. The pubs generally closed at 6 o'clock because it was important that people went home to have meals with their families rather than sat around drinking all night. That was the state for the first decades of the 20th century. But what we saw happening in the latter decades of the 20th century was that the voice of business grew stronger as the idea of deregulation and decentralisation, deregulation came about. The idea was there should be less regulation on business, so business would have more and more say in what they wanted to do. And then, sadly, the voices of civil society then grew weaker. And so to use those two examples, trading hours grew and grew to now the whole weekend is spent working and shopping for many people. The trading hours for pubs and clubs grew longer and later, so people could stay out drinking much, much longer than ever before. And family life for many people was diminished by that as well. So we can see how, I guess it's not just the Catholic Church, but really all civil society groups their voice began to be diminished, while business grew in authority and power in Australian society. Well, what do we do about that? Do we just say, well, that's just the way of the world, that's all there is, we have to go with it? No, I don't think so. There is another way. And what it is, that we need to look to the other groups in that civil society basket and say, are there things that we agree on together that we can put our name to and our voice to and go back and speak to government with a stronger, louder voice? So that we don't just get dwarfed by the power of the various chambers of commerce or the Business Council of Australia, those large business groups that have a strong voice to government, because we need to be able to pick up that strong voice to government as well. And so we as a parish, Epping Carlingford Catholic Parish, have joined the Sydney Alliance. And the Sydney Alliance is an alliance of like-minded civil society groups, which includes religious groups, includes Sydney Catholic Archdiocese, Parramatta Catholic Diocese, includes the Uniting Church. It includes charities like St Vincent de Paul. It includes religious groupings like the Sisters of St Joseph. It includes other non-Catholic and other non-Christian religions, the Jewish Board of Deputies and various Muslim groups. It also includes trade unions. It includes groups which advocate for refugees, groups which advocate for tenants and for the homeless. And so together, we actually are a really big grouping. And together, we have a strong voice if we can pick it up and use it together. Now, I saw this in action last year when just before the state election, hundreds of us from the Sydney Alliance gathered together in Westmead, and the leaders of the Alliance put the hard word on the then Treasurer, Matt Keane, and the now Treasurer, Daniel Mookie, on stage, asked him to make commitments to certain projects, certain values of the Alliance. And a key one was around security of tenancy, because with rent going up and up, landlords are quite free just to kick people out and then to bring in new tenants at a much higher price. And so the policy we wanted was the end of no-fault eviction, that if a tenant is a reasonable tenant, then they can't be evicted for no good reason. And so our leaders of the Alliance very skillfully put the challenges to our leaders. They didn't let them get away with just the talking points or the weasel words or the excuses. They held their feet to the fire and asked them to make commitments. And there on that stage that night, they said they couldn't yet make those commitments. But 3 days later, the now state government indeed did. And so no fault eviction, and so the end of no grounds eviction has now been legislated. That landlords cannot just evict people for no reason, so there's more security for those who rent. That's a victory because of the combined voice of the Sydney Alliance. And that's the kind of thing we can take part in. The Sydney Alliance won't cover every Catholic value. It's an alliance which kind of looks to say, what are the things we hold in common? And together we hold in common a care for refugees, a need for good public transport, a need for good education, housing, affordable and sustainable electricity and energy. Core things which do go to speak to the needs of the poorest of society and therefore are very much core things for us as a church. But these are things which all these other groups share in common as well. But what we can do by joining the Alliance is we both lend our heft to that increasingly growing group, but we also learn how to speak and act politically as well. We learn how to speak from values. We learn how to find common ground. We learn how to community organise. We learn how to write to and speak to and meet with our elected officials. And that's something which the Sydney Alliance trains people to do, whether they're doing a Sydney Alliance project or another project. That training for us as a member parish is now free. So I'd love people in our parish to take part in the upcoming training. The links are in the description below. And we speak about that this weekend in our parish. Because I would love for us as Catholics to pick up our voice, to be prophetic, to speak powerfully into our society about the things that matter to us, the things which are very much part of the kingdom of God. In doing so, we reaffirm who we are as a church, and we find our voice to speak on all the things which are important for us as followers of Jesus.